The low rumble of my rig couldn't drown out the deafening silence of the lonely highway. But it was the abandoned car, engine purring in the dead of night, that made my blood run cold. I've been driving trucks for over 2 decades now, and I thought I'd seen it all. Crazy drivers, nasty weather, and my fair share of close calls. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that moonless night in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. It was just past 2 a.m., and I was hauling a load of electronics from Salt Lake City to Chicago. The roads were empty, just the way I like them. No traffic, no distractions, just me and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out before me. The radio was playing some old country tune, barely audible over the hum of my engine. I'd just passed a sign telling me I was 50 miles out from the next town when I saw it. At first, it was just a pinprick of light in the distance, growing larger as I approached. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a car on the shoulder, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Now, I've seen plenty of breakdowns in my time, and normally I wouldn't think twice about it. But something about this one made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe it was the time of night or the fact that we were so far from civilization. Whatever it was, my gut was screaming at me that something wasn't right. As I drew nearer, I could see it was an old sedan, probably from the 90s. Its hazard lights were blinking steadily, and I could see the exhaust rising in the cool night air. The engine was running. I slowed my rig, torn between my instinct to help and the nagging feeling that I should keep on driving. In the end, my conscience won out. I couldn't leave someone stranded out here in good faith. I eased onto the shoulder, my brakes hissing as I came to a stop about 50 feet behind the car. Grabbing my flashlight from the glove box, I hopped down from the cab. The night was eerily still. The only sounds, the idling of my truck and the mysterious car ahead. I approached cautiously, sweeping my light across the vehicle. It was a faded blue Chevy covered in a fine layer of dust. As I got closer, I noticed there was no one in the driver's seat. My heart rate picked up a notch. I circled around to the passenger side, half expecting to see someone slumped over. Nothing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. "Anyone here? You need help?" No response, just the steady purr of the engine. I tried the doors, finding them all unlocked. The interior was clean, almost too clean for such an old car. No personal items, no signs of a struggle, just an empty vehicle with its engine running in the middle of nowhere. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed something else. The keys weren't in the ignition. How was this thing still running? I backed away from the car, my mind racing. Should I call the cops? But what would I tell them? I found a car with no driver and no keys, but the engine's running? They'd think I was crazy or drunk. That's when I heard it. A soft thud coming from the trunk. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again. Unmistakable this time. Something or someone was in the trunk. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct told me to run back to my truck and get the hell out of there. But what if someone was trapped? I couldn't just leave them. With shaking hands, I reached for the trunk release inside the car. It popped open with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent night. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the sliver of darkness between the trunk and the body of the car. Slowly, I raised my flashlight and lifted the trunk lid. Empty. The trunk was completely empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, a mixture of relief and confusion washing over me. Had I imagined the noise? I was just about to close the trunk when I saw it, a small folded piece of paper tucked into the corner. Against my better judgment, I reached in and grabbed it. As I unfolded the paper, my blood turned to ice. Written in jagged, hurried letters were 5 words, "Get back in your truck." I dropped the paper like it had burned me, stumbling backward. That's when I heard another sound that made my heart stop. The car's engine revving, loud and angry. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted back to my rig faster than I've moved in years, the sound of that engine roaring in my ears. I scrambled into the cab, fumbling with my keys. In my rearview mirror, I saw the car's headlights suddenly blaze to life, blindingly bright. The engine screamed as it peeled off the shoulder, tires screeching on the asphalt. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Finally, I got my truck started and slammed it into gear, my foot heavy on the gas. I watched in horror as the car rapidly closed the distance between us. I pushed my rig as hard as I dared, the speedometer creeping past speeds no fully loaded semi should be doing. But no matter how fast I went, that old Chevy kept pace, its headlights filling my mirrors. For miles this went on. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, sweat soaking through my shirt despite the cool air blasting from the AC. I was too scared to take my eyes off the road to reach for my phone or CB radio. Just when I thought my engine was going to give out, I saw lights in the distance. The town, finally. I felt a glimmer of hope. Surely, whatever this thing was, it wouldn't follow me into a populated area. As the first buildings came into view, I risked a glance in my mirror. The road behind me was empty. The car was gone, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. I didn't stop driving until I reached the truck stop on the other side of town. My hands were trembling as I cut the engine, and for a long moment I just sat there trying to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to convince myself it had all been a dream, some kind of hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But I could still feel the paper in my hands, still hear the roar of that engine. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the brightly lit diner, drinking cup after cup of coffee, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I called my dispatcher and told them I was taking a personal day. There was no way I was getting back on the road. It's been 3 months since that night, and I still can't shake it. I've searched news reports, online forums, anything I could think of to find an explanation. But there's nothing. No reports of a phantom car, no missing persons that fit the bill. It's like it never happened. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. Every time I pass a car on the shoulder now, my heart races. Every time I hear an engine rev, I break out in a cold sweat. I'm still driving trucks. It's all I know, all I've ever done. But I don't do night runs anymore. And I never, ever stop for abandoned vehicles. Sometimes when I'm on a quiet stretch of highway, I find myself watching my mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights appear. And in the darkest hours of the night, I swear I can still hear that engine roaring in the distance. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't heeded the warning in that note. I don't know who or what was driving that car. And to be honest, I don't want to know. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But I'll tell you this. If you're ever driving down a lonely highway in the dead of night, and you see a car on the shoulder with its engine running, don't stop, don't even slow down, just keep driving and don't look back. Because sometimes the real danger isn't in what you can see, but in what you can't. And out there on the empty roads, in the vast darkness between cities, there are things that defy explanation. Things that hunt in the night. Things that were never meant to be found. So keep your eyes on the road, your hands on the wheel, and whatever you do, don't stop. Because you never know when you might encounter something that will change your life forever, if you're lucky enough to escape with your life at all. The neon 24/7 sign flickered in the darkness, a beacon of false hope in a sea of emptiness. But it wasn't the ancient gas pumps or the peeling paint that sent chills down my spine. It was the attendant's eyes, pitch black and hungry. I've been trucking for 15 years, crisscrossing this country more times than I can count. I've seen my fair share of odd folks and creepy places, but nothing could have prepared me for that godforsaken gas station in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. It was just past midnight, and I was hauling a load of refrigerated goods from Reno to Albuquerque. The roads were empty, just a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desert darkness. My eyelids were getting heavy, and the coffee in my thermos had long gone cold. I needed to refuel both the truck and myself. The GPS showed nothing for miles, but then, like a mirage in the desert, I saw it. A single gas station, its lights a dim glow on the horizon. As I got closer, I could make out the faded sign, "Last Chance Gas, next station 200 miles. Talk about ominous foreshadowing. I pulled into the station, the gravel crunching under my tires. The place looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the 70s. Rusted oil cans and ancient tires were scattered around the lot, but beggars can't be choosers, and my fuel gauge was nudging dangerously close to empty. As I maneuvered my rig up to the pump, I noticed something odd. Despite the late hour and the station's dilapidated appearance, all the pumps were on. Their digital displays glowed an eerie green in the night. I climbed down from the cab, stretching my legs and breathing in the cool desert air. That's when I saw him, the attendant. He was standing in the doorway of the small convenience store, perfectly still, watching me. I raised a hand in greeting, but he didn't move. Didn't even blink. "Evening," I called out, trying to keep my voice casual despite the unease creeping up my spine. "You folks still open?" For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then slowly the attendant nodded, just once, up and down. I turned back to the pump, trying to shake off the weird vibe. As I reached for the nozzle, I caught my reflection in the scratched metal of the pump. My face looked gaunt, eyes sunken from too many miles and not enough sleep. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw something move behind me in the reflection. I whirled around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the attendant, still standing in the doorway, still watching. The pump clicked off, snapping me back to reality. I replaced the nozzle, screwed on my gas cap, and hesitated. I needed coffee, maybe some snacks for the road, but the thought of going into that store, of getting closer to that attendant, made my skin crawl. "Get a grip," I told myself. "You're a grown man, for Christ's sake, spooked by some old guy at a gas station." I squared my shoulders and walked towards the store. As I got closer, I could make out more details of the attendant. He was older than I'd first thought, his skin wrinkled and leathery like old parchment. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold. They were black. Not dark brown, but black, like two holes cut into his face, absorbing all light. I just need to pay for the gas," I stammered, my earlier bravado evaporating. "And maybe grab some coffee if you've got it." The attendant didn't respond. He just stepped back, opening the door wider. An invitation, or a trap. I stepped inside and immediately wished I hadn't. The air was thick and stale, like the place hadn't been opened in years. Dust coated every surface, and the few sad products on the shelves looked like they'd expired during the Bush administration. The first Bush. The attendant shuffled behind the counter, those black eyes never leaving me. I fumbled for my wallet, hands shaking as I pulled out some cash. "Just the gas," I said, deciding I could do without coffee. I just wanted to get out of there. As I placed the money on the counter, the attendant's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. His grip was like ice and far stronger than his frail appearance suggested. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. "This isn't a place for the living." I tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. "What are you talking about? Let go of me." His black eyes bored into mine. "They're coming. They always come for the strays." A sound from outside made us both turn. Through the grimy window, I saw headlights approaching, but something was wrong. The lights were too bright, too white, and they were moving too fast. The attendant finally released my wrist. "Run," he hissed. "Run now while you still can." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my ears. As I ran for my truck, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The headlights were almost at the station now, but I still couldn't see the vehicle they belonged to. It was like the lights were floating, unattached to anything solid. I scrambled into my cab, hands shaking as I fought to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into gear, tires squealing as I peeled out of the station. In my rearview mirror, I saw the lights pull into the station. But it wasn't a car. It wasn't anything I could describe. Just a swirling mass of darkness with those impossibly bright lights at its center. And it was spreading, consuming the gas station like a wave of black ink. I drove faster than I ever had in my life, the speedometer needle buried deep in the red. Miles flew by, but I didn't slow down, couldn't slow down. It wasn't until the first rays of dawn began to lighten the sky that I finally eased off the gas. As the adrenaline wore off, doubt began to creep in. Had it all been some kind of hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and too much caffeine? But then I looked down at my wrist. 5 perfect bruises, like fingerprints, were darkening on my skin. I've tried to find that gas station since then, drove that same stretch of road a dozen times, but it's never there. Sometimes late at night I think I see a glimmer of neon in the distance, but it always vanishes when I get closer, like a mirage fading in the desert heat. I don't know what happened that night. Don't know who or what that attendant really was or what was chasing us. But I do know this. There are places in this world that don't show up on any map. Places that exist in the spaces between, where the veil between our world and something else is thin. If you're ever driving down a lonely highway in the dead of night and you see a rundown gas station glowing like a beacon in the darkness, Keep driving. No matter how tired you are, no matter how low your tank is running, just keep going. Because some pit stops aren't meant for the living, and some roads lead to places we were never meant to see. As for me, I still drive trucks, still cross the country under starlit skies, but I always make sure my tank is full before the sun goes down. And I never ever stop at gas stations I can't find on my GPS, because out there in the vast emptiness, in the spaces between cities and between worlds, there are things waiting in the darkness, things with hunger in their eyes and ice in their touch. And if you're not careful, you might just become another lost soul, trapped at the last chance gas station at the end of the world. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but nothing compares to that night in Montana. The creature that crossed my path wasn't just unnatural, it was impossible, and it's been haunting my dreams ever since. It was late October, and I was hauling a load of electronics from Seattle to Minneapolis. The I-90 stretched out before me, a river of asphalt cutting through the darkness. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. I'd been driving for about 14 hours straight, fueled by gas station coffee and the need to make my delivery on time. The radio crackled with static between stations, so I'd shut it off hours ago. The only sounds were the hum of my engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on the road. It was around 2 a.m. when I crossed into Montana. The traffic had thinned out to almost nothing, just me and the occasional long-haul trucker sharing the lonely highway. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks lost in a sea of low-hanging clouds. I was just starting to think about finding a place to pull over for a few hours of shut-eye when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a reflection off the guardrail. But as I got closer, I realized it was something moving in the road ahead. My headlights caught it, and for a split second, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was big, easily the size of a bear, but it moved all wrong. Its gait was jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. As it lumbered into the middle of my lane, I had to fight the urge to swerve. Years of experience kicked in, and I eased off the gas, gently applying the brakes. The last thing I wanted was to lose control at this speed, especially with whatever that thing was in front of me. The creature turned towards my truck, and I felt my blood run cold. Its face, if you could call it that, was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It had too many eyes, all of them glowing an unnatural green in my headlights. Its mouth was a jagged slash across what should have been its chest, filled with needle-sharp teeth. I laid on the horn, hoping the noise would scare it off. Instead, it reared up on its hind legs, towering over my truck. That's when I saw its arms, or rather its wings. They unfurled from its sides, leathery and bat-like, spanning wider than my entire rig. In that moment, I knew I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. Something that defied every law of nature I thought I knew. Time seemed to slow down. I could see every detail of the creature with horrifying clarity. Its skin was a patchwork of scales and fur, oozing a viscous fluid that gleamed in the moonlight. Those many eyes blinked independently of each other, and I swear I saw intelligence in them. Not animal cunning, but something else. Something ancient and malevolent. I was going too fast to stop completely. In the split second I had to decide, I chose to thread the needle. I aimed for the space between the creature and the guardrail, silently praying I had enough room. As I sped past, the creature let out a shriek that set my teeth on edge. It was like metal scraping on metal, mixed with the wail of a wounded animal. I felt something slam into the side of my trailer, hard enough to make the whole rig shudder. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get as far away as possible. I pushed my truck to its limits, the engine roaring in protest as I flew down the highway. For miles I drove like that, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Every shadow on the road looked like that creature. Every sound could have been its unearthly shriek. It wasn't until I saw the lights of a small town ahead that I finally started to relax. I pulled into the first truck stop I saw, my hands shaking so bad I could barely turn off the engine. For a long time I just sat there, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by too many hours on the road and not enough sleep. But I knew better. The dent in my trailer was proof enough that whatever I'd encountered was all too real. As the first light of dawn started to break, I finally worked up the courage to inspect the damage. The side of my trailer looked like it had been hit by a wrecking ball. There was a huge dent, easily 4 feet across, with strange scratch marks around the edges. And there, stuck in one of the deeper grooves, was a single scale. It was about the size of my palm, iridescent in the early morning light and hard as steel. I pocketed the scale before anyone else could see it. I don't know why. Maybe as proof to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Or maybe because some part of me knew that no one would believe me if I told them what really happened. I called my dispatcher and made up some story about swerving to avoid a deer. They weren't happy about the damage to the truck, but it was believable enough. More believable than the truth, anyway. I finished my run to Minneapolis, but my heart wasn't in it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature. Those many eyes, that twisted mouth. The way it moved, like something wearing a skin that didn't quite fit. When I got home, I tried to research what I'd seen. I spent hours online looking up cryptids and folklore, but nothing quite matched. The closest I could find were some old Native American legends about skinwalkers, but even those didn't capture the sheer otherworldliness of what I'd encountered. I've been back on that stretch of I-90 many times since that night. Every time I find myself scanning the road ahead, half expecting to see that creature again. Part of me hopes I will, if only to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But a bigger part of me prays that I never lay eyes on it again. The scale sits on my bedside table now, a constant reminder of that night. Sometimes, when the light hits it just right, I swear I can see something moving beneath its surface. Like it's still alive, still connected to whatever nightmare spawned it. I've thought about getting rid of it, throwing it away or burying it somewhere deep in the woods, but I can't bring myself to do it. It's the only proof I have that what I saw was real, and sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I wonder if it's not just proof but a warning. Because if that creature exists, what else might be out there? What other impossible things are lurking in the shadows just beyond the reach of our headlights? I still drive trucks, it's all I know, all I've ever done. But I don't do night runs through Montana anymore, and I always keep my eyes on the road ahead, because you never know what might come crawling out of the darkness. Some nights when I'm lying in bed unable to sleep, I can almost convince myself it was all a dream, that there are no monsters lurking on lonely highways, no creatures that defy explanation. But then I look at that scale, shimmering in the moonlight, and I know the truth. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that shouldn't exist but do. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, you might just cross paths with one of them. So if you're ever driving down a dark, lonely stretch of highway, and you see something move in the road ahead, something that doesn't look quite right, don't slow down, don't stop to get a better look. Just keep driving as fast as you can and pray that whatever it is doesn't decide to follow you home. Because once you've seen what's really out there, you can never unsee it. And the nightmares, they never really go away. The coffee was always fresh, the waitresses never aged, and the patrons, well, they never seemed to leave. It wasn't until my third visit that I realized I'd stumbled into a truck stop where time stood still. I've been driving big rigs for the better part of 2 decades, crisscrossing the country more times than I can count. You get used to the rhythm of the road, the sameness of the truck stops, and the faces that blur together after a while. But Willie's pit stop was different. I just didn't know how different until it was almost too late. It was a crisp autumn night when I first pulled into Willie's. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to San Francisco, fighting to keep my eyes open as the miles ticked by. The neon sign buzzed into view just as my eyelids were getting dangerously heavy. Willie's Pit Stop, best coffee this side of anywhere, it proclaimed in garish pink and green. The parking lot was surprisingly full for the middle of the night, a mix of semis and passenger cars. As I maneuvered my rig into a spot, I noticed something odd. All the vehicles looked dated. Not quite classic car status, but definitely older models. I chalked it up to being in a rural area and headed inside. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and the smell of coffee and grease hit me like a wall. The place looked like it had been plucked straight out of the 1970s. Vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner, waitresses in uniforms that hadn't been fashionable in decades. I slid into a booth, the vinyl creaking under my weight. A waitress appeared almost instantly, coffee pot in hand. Her name tag read, Darlene. "What'll it be, hun?" she asked, already pouring me a cup without waiting for an answer. Just coffee for now, thanks, I said, stifling a yawn. Maybe some pie later if it's any good. Darlene winked at me. Best pie you'll ever taste, sugar. I'll give you a few minutes to decide. As she walked away, I took a sip of the coffee. It was perfect. Hot, strong, and somehow exactly how I liked it without adding anything. I looked around the diner, taking in the other patrons. There was a mix of truckers and what looked like locals, all engaged in quiet conversation or hunched over plates of food. What struck me was how comfortable everyone looked, like they'd been here 100 times before. There was none of the restless energy you usually find in truck stops, with everyone eager to get back on the road. These folks looked like they had all the time in the world. I polished off my coffee, and true to her word, Darlene was back in a flash to refill it. Ready for that pie yet, hun? I glanced at my watch, surprised to see only 10 minutes had passed. It felt like I'd been there much longer. Sure, why not? What's good? Cherry's our specialty, Darlene said with a smile. Made fresh daily. The pie, when it arrived, was indeed the best I'd ever tasted. The crust was perfectly flaky, the filling just the right balance of sweet and tart. I found myself savoring every bite, the urgency of my schedule fading to the back of my mind. It wasn't until I'd finished the pie and my third cup of coffee that I realized something was off. I checked my watch again, and it still showed only 30 minutes had passed since I'd arrived. But the quality of light coming through the windows had changed, like dawn was breaking. Confused, I pulled out my phone to check the time. The screen was black. Dead battery, I assumed, though I could have sworn it was nearly full when I'd arrived. I flagged down Darlene. Excuse me, do you have the time? She glanced at a clock on the wall I hadn't noticed before. It's 3:17, sugar. You need to be somewhere? I blinked in surprise. That can't be right. I pulled in here around 2:30. Darlene just smiled, that same patient, knowing smile she'd worn all night. Time flies when you're enjoying yourself, doesn't it? More coffee? I declined, suddenly feeling uneasy. I paid my bill and headed for the door, nodding goodbye to Darlene. As I pushed it open, the bell jingled again, and I could have sworn I heard her say, "See you soon, hun." The parking lot was bathed in the gray light of early dawn. My truck was where I'd left it, but it looked different. Older somehow, like it had aged years in the few hours I'd been inside. I climbed into the cab, my unease growing. The engine sputtered to life, and I pulled out of Willie's, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror, watching as the truck stop receded into the distance. It wasn't until I hit the interstate that I got my next shock. My onboard GPS was registering the date as 3 days later than when I'd pulled into Willie's. I tried to convince myself it was a glitch, but deep down I knew something impossible had happened. I completed my run to San Francisco in a daze, unable to shake the memory of Willie's. When I got home, I tried to research the place, but came up empty. It was like it didn't exist. Months passed, and I started to think maybe I dreamed the whole thing. The memory of Willie's faded, becoming just another strange story from the road. Until almost a year to the day later, I found myself on the same stretch of highway. It was the middle of the night, and I was dead tired. And there, shimmering in the distance like a mirage, was the familiar neon sign. I knew I should keep driving. Every instinct told me to put my foot down and not look back. But the pull was too strong. Before I knew it, I was pulling into the parking lot. Everything was exactly as I remembered it. The dated cars, the 70s decor, even Darlene with her ever-present coffee pot. She greeted me like an old friend, like no time had passed at all. "Welcome back, hun," she said, sliding a piece of cherry pie in front of me without asking. "We've been expecting you." That's when I noticed the other patrons. Really noticed them. The trucker in the corner booth. Hadn't he been wearing that exact same shirt last time? And the couple by the window, frozen in the same intimate conversation. With a chill, I realized they weren't just similar to the people I'd seen before. They were the exact same people, in the exact same positions, like actors on a stage replaying the same scene over and over. I stood up so fast I knocked over my coffee. "What is this place?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What's going on here?" Darlene just smiled that infuriating, knowing smile. "It's a pit stop, hun, a place to rest, to take a break from the long road." "But the time, the date," I stammered. "Time works differently here," she said softly. "For some folks, it doesn't move at all. For others, well, They stay a little while and find years have passed when they leave. It's different for everyone. I backed away, my heart pounding. I have to go. I can't stay here. Darlene nodded, no surprise in her eyes. I understand, sugar, but remember, Willie's will always be here when you need it. When the road gets too long, when you need a break from time itself, we'll be waiting. I all but ran to my truck, peeling out of the parking lot like the devil himself was chasing me. In my rearview mirror, I watched Willie's fade away, the neon sign flickering out like a dying star. I've never gone back to Willie's, never even seen it again, though I've driven that stretch of road 100 times since. But sometimes on long nights when the highway seems endless and time feels like a weight on my shoulders, I find myself looking for that familiar neon glow. Part of me hopes I never see it again. But another part wonders what it would be like to step outside of time just for a little while. To sit in a booth where the coffee is always hot, the pie is always fresh, and the weight of the world fades away with each tick of the clock. So if you're ever driving down a lonely highway in the dead of night, and you see a truck stop that looks like it's been frozen in time, think carefully before you pull in. Because at Willie's pit stop, you might find the rest you're looking for, but you might also lose more than you bargained for. And once you've had a taste of timelessness, the real world might never feel quite the same again. The whistle pierced the night, a mournful wail that shouldn't exist. I saw the locomotive's headlight before I saw the train, but there was one problem. The tracks it rode had been torn up decades ago. I've been driving trucks for nearly 30 years and I thought I'd seen it all. Crazy drivers, freak weather, and my fair share of near misses. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that moonless night in rural Pennsylvania. It was late October and I was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Philadelphia. The I-80 stretched out before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. The clock on my dashboard read 2:17 a.m. and I was fighting to keep my eyes open. The radio crackled with static between stations, so I'd shut it off hours ago. The only sounds were the hum of my engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on the road. I was just passing the exit for Loganton when I first heard it. A faint whistle in the distance, so soft I thought I might have imagined it. I shook my head, trying to clear the cobwebs. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. But then I heard it again, louder this time. A train whistle, clear as day, which was impossible because there were no active rail lines anywhere near this stretch of highway. I'd driven this route hundreds of times, and I knew for a fact that the nearest tracks were miles away. I straightened in my seat, suddenly wide awake. The whistle came again, closer now, accompanied by the distant rumble of something heavy moving fast. My eyes scanned the darkness beyond my headlights, searching for the source of the sound. That's when I saw it. A pinprick of light in the distance, growing larger by the second. A headlight. A train's headlight. But where the hell were the tracks? As it got closer, I could make out more details. It was an old steam locomotive, the kind you see in museums or tourist attractions. Smoke billowed from its stack, and I could see the glow of its firebox. But what really got me was how it was moving. It wasn't on any tracks I could see. Instead, it seemed to be gliding just above the ground, maybe a foot or two in the air. I blinked hard, sure I must be hallucinating. Ghostly trains don't just appear out of nowhere, floating above the ground. But when I opened my eyes, it was still there, getting closer by the second. The whistle blew again, so loud now it seemed to rattle my teeth. And that's when I realized it was headed straight for the highway, straight for me. I had seconds to react. My hands gripped the wheels so tight my knuckles turned white. I could either swerve and risk jackknifing my rig, or I could hit the brakes and pray I stopped in time. In that split second, as the train bore down on me, I made my choice. I slammed on the brakes, the sudden deceleration throwing me forward against my seatbelt. The tires screeched in protest, the smell of burning rubber filling the cab. The train was almost on top of me now. I could see figures in the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. They looked wrong somehow. Their features were blurred like an old photograph left out in the sun. And their eyes, God, their eyes were just empty sockets, black as pitch. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact, but it never came. Instead, I felt a rush of icy cold air wash over me like I'd been plunged into a frozen lake. The roar of the train filled my ears, deafening me. And then, silence. I opened my eyes slowly, half expecting to find myself in the afterlife, but I was still there on the highway, my truck stopped dead in the middle of the road. My hands were shaking as I put the rig in park and climbed out on unsteady legs. The night was quiet again. No sign of the train, no lingering whistle, just the soft tick of my engine cooling and the distant hoot of an owl. I walked to the front of my truck, inspecting for any damage. There wasn't a scratch. That's when I noticed something on the ground, a piece of paper yellowed with age fluttering in the breeze. I picked it up, my blood running cold as I read the faded print. It was a train ticket dated October 28, 1918. The very day the infamous wreck of the 1918 Limited occurred, less than a mile from where I now stood. I'd heard stories about that wreck. It was one of the deadliest train accidents in Pennsylvania history. The official report blamed it on a signaling error, but locals had always whispered about darker causes. Some said the engineer had gone mad, others claimed sabotage. But all the stories agreed on one thing: not a single passenger survived. I climbed back into my truck, the ticket clutched in my hand. As I started the engine, my headlights illuminated something I hadn't noticed before. Parallel marks on the asphalt, about the width of train tracks apart, stretching across the highway and disappearing into the woods on either side. They looked like they'd been burned into the road. I put the truck in gear and got the hell out of there, my mind reeling. I've always been a rational man, never put much stock in ghost stories or the supernatural. But what I saw that night, there's no rational explanation for it. I completed my run to Philadelphia in a daze, unable to shake the memory of those empty-eyed passengers, the ghostly train that defied all logic. When I got home, I researched the 1918 Limited, digging deeper than I ever had before. What I found chilled me to the bone. The train had been running late that night, trying to make up time. Witnesses in towns it passed through reported seeing it fly by at impossible speeds, the whistle screaming like a banshee. And here's the kicker. The wreck didn't happen on the scheduled route. Somehow the train had veered off the existing tracks, ending up miles from where it should have been, right where I saw it all these years later. I've driven that stretch of I-80 many times since that night. Sometimes when the moon is dark and the night is quiet, I think I hear a distant whistle. I've never seen the train again, but I know it's out there, reliving its final journey over and over for all eternity. I keep that ticket in my wallet now, a reminder that there are things in this world we can't explain, things that shouldn't exist but do. It's a heavy burden, knowing what I know, seeing what I've seen. Some nights when I'm lying in bed unable to sleep, I can almost convince myself it was all a dream, that there are no ghost trains riding invisible tracks, no passengers doomed to repeat their final moments for eternity. But then I look at that ticket, feel its aged paper between my fingers, and I know the truth. There are layers to this world, hidden just beneath the surface of what we think we know. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, those layers bleed together. The past crashes into the present, and the impossible becomes terrifyingly real. So if you're ever driving down a lonely stretch of highway on a moonless night, and you hear a whistle in the distance, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away, because the 1918 Limited is still out there, still making its final run. And you never know when your path might cross with a ghost train, riding tracks that no longer exist. Just keep driving, keep your eyes on the road ahead, and pray that the barriers between our world and whatever lies beyond stay strong. Because once you've glimpsed what's on the other side, you can never unsee it. And the knowledge, it'll haunt you for the rest of your days. They call it Dead Man's Curve, and it's not just because of the accidents. It's the place where trucks go to die, where engines fail and brakes give out for no reason. But it's what I saw there on that foggy night that still keeps me awake. I've been hauling freight across the country for over 2 decades now. I've seen my share of dangerous roads and nasty weather, but nothing compares to that stretch of highway cutting through the Appalachians. Most truckers avoid it if they can, taking the long way around, even if it costs them time and fuel. But sometimes, when you're on a tight schedule and the dispatcher is breathing down your neck, you don't have a choice. It was late November, and I was running a load of electronics from Charlotte to Pittsburgh. The weather had been miserable all day, a cold drizzle that couldn't seem to make up its mind whether it wanted to be rain or snow. As night fell, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the mountains in a ghostly shroud. I'd been pushing hard all day, trying to make up time lost to traffic and construction. By the time I hit the mountain pass, my eyes were burning with fatigue, and I was on my fourth cup of gas station coffee. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to find a place to pull over and rest, but I was so close to my destination. Just a few more hours, I told myself. I can make it. The fog grew thicker as I climbed higher into the mountains. My headlights barely penetrated the gloom, turning the world beyond my windshield into a swirling gray void. The radio faded to static, and even my GPS was acting up, the screen flickering and glitching. That's when I saw the sign, its reflective surface glowing eerily in my headlights. Dead Man's Curve, proceed with caution. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I'd heard stories about this place, whispered warnings in truck stops and late-night CB radio chatter, but I'd always dismissed them as urban legends, the kind of tales truckers tell to spook the newbies. As I approached the curve, my truck began to shudder. At first, I thought it was just the rough road, but then the engine started to sputter and cough. Warning lights flashed on my dashboard, systems failing one by one. "No, no, no," I muttered, desperately trying to keep control of the rig. "Not here, not now." I managed to guide the truck onto the shoulder just as the engine died completely. The silence was sudden and absolute, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and my own ragged breathing. I sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, trying to calm my racing heart. This was bad, really bad. I was miles from the nearest town with no cell service and a dead truck on one of the most dangerous stretches of road in the country. After a few deep breaths, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab. The fog swirled around me, so thick I could barely see the front of my own truck. I popped the hood, though I knew it was probably futile. I'm handy with basic repairs, but this felt different, wrong somehow. As I was bent over the engine, I heard it, a low rumble in the distance, growing louder. Another truck approaching. Relief washed over me, surely they'd stop to help. But as the sound grew closer, I realized something was off. The engine noise wasn't quite right. It sounded older somehow. And there was something else underneath it, a sound I couldn't quite place. I stepped back onto the road, waving my flashlight. "Hey, over here, I need help!" The rumble grew to a roar, and suddenly out of the fog it appeared. But it wasn't a modern semi, it was an old truck, probably from the 50s or 60s, its chrome grille gleaming despite the gloom. And it was heading straight for me. I dove out of the way, hitting the asphalt hard as the truck roared past. As it did, I caught a glimpse of the driver. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken and lifeless. And behind him in the cab, I saw shadows moving, writhing, like the truck was full of restless souls. As quickly as it had appeared, the phantom truck vanished into the fog, but the sound lingered, fading slowly, mixed with what I now recognized as screams, distant, echoing screams. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. What the hell had I just seen? I ran back to my truck, hands shaking as I tried to start the engine. To my shock, it roared to life as if nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't hesitate. I threw it into gear and got the hell out of there, pushing my rig harder than I ever had before. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, the mountains nothing but a dark smudge in my rearview mirror. When I finally reached Pittsburgh, I was a wreck. I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't get the image of that ghostly truck and its damned driver out of my head. I called my dispatcher and told him I was taking some personal time. Then I holed up in a motel room for 3 days, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. I've since learned I'm not the only one. Over the years, I've heard from other truckers who've had similar encounters on Dead Man's Curve. Phantom vehicles, inexplicable breakdowns, glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. Some say it's the ghosts of all those who've died on that treacherous stretch of road. Others claim it's something older, something that was there long before the highway was built. A few even whisper that the curve itself is alive somehow, hungry for the souls of unwary travelers. I don't know what the truth is. All I know is that I've never taken that route again, no matter how much time it costs me. Some risks aren't worth taking, and some places are best left alone. But here's the thing that really keeps me up at night. I've talked to engineers, road safety experts, even a geologist once. They all say the same thing. There's no reason for that stretch of road to be as dangerous as it is. The curve isn't particularly sharp, the grade isn't unusually steep. On paper, it should be just another mountain pass. So why do so many accidents happen there? Why do trucks break down at 10 times the normal rate? And what the hell was that thing I saw in the fog? I don't have answers. I'm not sure I want them, but I do know this. If you're ever driving through the Appalachians on a foggy night and you see a sign for Dead Man's Curve, do yourself a favor. Turn around, take the long way, because some stretches of road don't want to be traveled and some curves are better left untaken. As for me, I'm still driving, still hauling loads across this vast country, but I'm more careful now, more aware of the hidden dangers that lurk in the shadows of lonely highways. And every time I pass a truck stopped on the shoulder, I say a little prayer. Not just for the driver's safety, but for their soul. Because out there in the darkness, where the veil between worlds grows thin, there are things waiting. Hungry things. And sometimes when the fog rolls in and the night grows deep, they reach out and pluck the unwary from the land of the living. So keep your eyes on the road, your hands on the wheel, and if you hear the rumble of an old truck on a lonely mountain pass, don't look back. Just drive. Drive like hell itself is on your tail. Because out there on Dead Man's Curve, it just might be. The click of a gun's hammer being pulled back is a sound you never forget, especially when it's inches from your head. I was just trying to get home, that's all. A simple drive from the late shift at the diner turned into the longest night of my life. I keep telling myself I should have taken the highway, should have filled up my tank before leaving work, should have done 100 things differently. But here I am, replaying that night over and over, wondering how I made it out alive. It was close to midnight when I pulled out of the diner's parking lot. The neon Open 24 HRS sign flickered weakly behind me as I turned onto the empty street. My ancient Corolla groaned as I accelerated, the engine protesting as always. I'd been meaning to get it checked out, but tips had been lousy lately, another item on the endless to-do list of a single mom working 2 jobs. I chose the back roads home, a habit I'd picked up to avoid the speed traps on the highway. Plus, at this hour, there was something soothing about driving through the sleepy neighborhoods. Street lamps cast pools of amber light on silent houses, and the occasional cat darted across manicured lawns. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the diner. I was about halfway home when I felt it. A slight shudder ran through the car, barely noticeable at first. Then came a series of sputters, each one sending a jolt of panic through my chest. No, 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 I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The engine coughed once, twice, and then went silent. The car rolled to a stop, momentum carrying it just far enough to reach the curb. For a moment, I just sat there, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The sudden silence was deafening. I lifted my head and tried the key. Nothing. Not even a click. "Come on, you piece of junk," I hissed, turning the key again and again. The dashboard remained stubbornly dark. With a sigh, I flicked on the hazard lights and pulled out my phone. The battery icon blinked red, 2%, just enough for one call. I dialed my sister's number, praying she'd pick up. It went straight to voicemail. Of course, she worked nights too. I glanced at my surroundings, really noticing them for the first time. This wasn't one of the neat suburban neighborhoods I usually pass through. The houses here were run down, many with boarded-up windows. Overgrown lawns spilled onto cracked sidewalks, and more than a few cars on the street were up on blocks. A flicker of unease ran down my spine. I didn't recognize this area. How had I gotten so turned around? The stress of the breakdown must have disoriented me more than I realized. I peered at the street sign on the corner, but years of neglect had left it unreadable. A dog barked in the distance, the sound echoing off silent houses. I jumped, my nerves already on edge. "Get it together, Sarah," I whispered to myself. "You're a grown woman, not some scared kid." I had 2 choices: sit here and hope someone drove by, or try to find help. Neither option seemed great, but I couldn't just wait all night. With a deep breath, I grabbed my purse and stepped out of the car. The night air was thick and humid, carrying the faint scent of garbage and something else I couldn't quite place. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as I walked down the cracked sidewalk. Every shadow made me flinch, imagination running wild with each rustle or distant sound. I'd gone about a block when I saw it. A payphone. The sight was so unexpected I almost laughed. Who even used payphones anymore? But right now, it looked like salvation. I hurried towards it, fishing in my purse for loose change. My hands shook as I fed quarters into the slot. The dial tone hummed, and I punched in the number for a taxi service. As it rang, my eyes darted around, taking in my surroundings. The payphone stood in a small pool of sickly yellow light, bordered by the dark mouth of an alley on one side and a boarded-up storefront on the other. "Come on, pick up," I muttered. On the fifth ring, a bored voice answered. I quickly gave them my location, or what I thought was my location, and begged them to hurry. The dispatcher assured me someone would be there in 20 minutes. I hung up and leaned against the payphone, relief washing over me. Just 20 minutes, I could handle that. I'd wait by my car, and soon this whole ordeal would be over. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the alley beside me. I froze, heartbeat thundering in my ears. A figure emerged from the shadows, and I felt the air leave my lungs. He was tall, unnaturally thin, wearing a stained hoodie despite the warm night. But it was his eyes that terrified me. Glassy, unfocused, with pupils so dilated they seemed to swallow the irises whole. "Hey there, sweetheart," he slurred, a twisted grin revealing yellowed teeth. "You lost?" I clutched my purse tighter, taking a step back. No, I'm fine, just waiting for a ride." He took another step forward, and I caught a whiff of body odor and something chemical. "Oh, don't be like that. Pretty thing like you shouldn't be out here alone. Why don't you let me keep you company?" My back hit the wall of the boarded-up store. I glanced left and right, looking for an escape route, but he was between me and the street. "Please," I said, hating how my voice shook. "I don't want any trouble." He chuckled, the sound sending chills down my spine. "No trouble at all, sweetheart. Just hand over that purse and maybe we can have some fun after." I saw his hand move towards his waistband, and panic exploded in my chest. Without thinking, I bolted. I ducked under his outstretched arm and ran, feet pounding against the cracked pavement. I could hear him shouting behind me, his footsteps giving chase. I ran blindly, turning corners at random, lungs burning as I gasped for air. The streets all looked the same, broken, abandoned, hostile. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I was getting more lost with every step, but terror drove me forward. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I ducked into an alley, pressing myself against the rough brick wall. My chest heaved as I tried to quiet my breathing, straining to listen for any sounds of pursuit. Nothing. Just the distant wail of a siren and the hum of the city. Had I lost him? I allowed myself to relax slightly, sliding down the wall until I was sitting on the grimy pavement. Tears streamed down my face as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving me shaky and exhausted. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to gather the courage to move. The sound of voices made me tense up again. They were coming closer, at least two men, their words slurred and punctuated by laughter. I held my breath as they passed the mouth of the alley, praying they wouldn't look my way. They paused. My heart seemed to stop. Then one of them let out a whoop and lurched on, his companion following with a stream of curses. I waited until their voices faded before letting out a shuddering breath. I had to move. I couldn't stay here. Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet, legs trembling. I peeked out of the alley, looking both ways before stepping onto the sidewalk. Nothing looked familiar. How far had I run? A flash of red caught my eye. Across the street, barely visible in the gloom, was a faded Coca-Cola sign. It hung over what looked like a small convenience store. The windows were barred, but a dim light shone from inside. Open at this hour? It seemed impossible, but right now it was the only glimmer of hope I had. I crossed the street quickly, constantly looking over my shoulder. As I got closer, I could make out a figure behind the counter, an elderly man, his face lined with wrinkles and crowned by a shock of white hair. He was reading a newspaper, seemingly oblivious to the world outside. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, making me wince at the sudden noise. The old man looked up, his eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of me. I must have looked a mess, hair wild, mascara streaked down my cheeks, clothes dirty from my time in the alley. I need help," I managed to croak out. "My car broke down and there was a man. I got lost." The old man's expression softened. Without a word, he reached under the counter and pulled out an ancient rotary phone. As he dialed, he gestured to a small table in the corner. "Sit," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "You're safe here." I sank into the chair, the events of the night crashing over me in waves. I could hear the old man talking quietly into the phone, but the words didn't register. I was safe. For now, at least. Minutes ticked by. The old man brought me a bottle of water, which I gulped down gratefully. We didn't speak much. He seemed to sense that I wasn't ready to talk. Instead, he turned on a small TV behind the counter, the quiet murmur of a late-night talk show filling the silence. The squeal of brakes outside made me jump. The old man peered out the window and nodded. "Your ride's here." I stood on shaky legs, overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done if—" He waved off my thanks. "You get home safe now, and next time—" He fixed me with a stern look. "You take the highway." As I climbed into the back of the patrol car, the old man had called the police, not a taxi. I looked back at the store. In the harsh glare of the cruiser's headlights, it looked different. Older, more run down than I remembered. It wasn't until we were driving away, the officer asking me questions I barely heard, that I realized something. The Coca-Cola sign that had drawn me to the store, it was gone. In its place was a faded For Lease banner, barely visible in the pre-dawn light. I never did find out who that old man was or how a store that shouldn't have been open saved me that night. But every time I drive past that neighborhood, always in broad daylight, always on the main road, I say a silent thank you, and I never ever take the back roads after dark. The stench of stale coffee couldn't mask the rotten smell coming from the bathroom stall. I should have kept driving, should have trusted my gut when it told me this rest stop was trouble. But exhaustion makes fools of us all, and now I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. It was hour 14 of what should have been a 10-hour haul. I'd been fighting my drooping eyelids for the last 100 miles, the white lines on the asphalt blurring into a hypnotic stream. The rest stop 1 mile sign was like a beacon of hope in the darkness. I didn't care that I was in the middle of nowhere, that I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours. All I wanted was a chance to stretch my legs, splash some water on my face, and chug enough caffeine to get me through the home stretch. The exit ramp materialized out of the gloom, and I guided my rig onto it with a sigh of relief. The rest stop parking lot was empty, save for a beat-up RV that had clearly seen better days. Its faded paint and rusty edges spoke of years on the road, a home for someone who'd left the conventional world behind. I eased my truck into one of the oversized spots, the air brakes hissing as I set them. For a moment I just sat there, enjoying the silence after hours of engine rumble and talk radio. The fluorescent lights of the rest stop building cast a sickly glow over the cracked pavement. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but it was better than nothing. Grabbing my thermos, I climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting the ground with a thud that echoed in the empty lot. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite place. I shrugged it off. Rest stops never smelled great. The automatic doors slid open with a wheeze, welcoming me into a space that was trying its best to be cheerful and failing miserably. Faded posters advertising local attractions hung crookedly on the walls. A rack of wrinkled maps stood next to a vending machine that looked like it had been manufactured sometime during the Reagan administration. But it was the man behind the information desk that really caught my attention. He was rail thin, with skin so pale it was almost translucent under the harsh lighting. His eyes were sunken, darting around the room as if searching for threats in every corner. When he saw me, his lips stretched into what I think was supposed to be a smile, but it never reached those nervous eyes. "Evening," I grunted, heading for the coffee machine. No response. I glanced back, only to find him staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I busied myself with filling my thermos, the gurgle of cheap coffee providing a welcome distraction. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. "Long haul?" His voice made me jump. It was higher than I expected, with a slight tremor that set my nerves on edge. I turned, forcing a neutral expression. "Yeah, heading up to Millbrook. Should be there by morning if I can keep my eyes open." He nodded, those darting eyes never staying in one place for long. "Lots of truckers come through here. Not so many lately, though. People been taking other routes." There was something in the way he said it that made my stomach clench. I screwed the lid on my thermos, suddenly eager to get back on the road. Exhaustion be damned. "Well, thanks for the coffee," I said, already moving towards the door. "I should get going." "Wait." The sharpness in his voice stopped me in my tracks. You might want to use the facilities before you go. It's a long way to the next stop." He had a point. Loath as I was to admit it, my bladder had been complaining for the last 50 miles, and who knew when I'd get another chance. With a reluctant nod, I changed course for the restroom. The smell hit me as soon as I pushed open the door. It was that same metallic odor from outside, but stronger now, mixed with the unmistakable stench of decay. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. What the hell had died in here? I was about to turn around to hell with my bladder when I heard it. A soft whimper coming from the last stall. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, definitely human, definitely in distress. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the grimy tiles. "You okay in there?" No response, just another muffled sound that might have been a sob. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I moved closer to the stall. "I'm coming in, all right? Just want to make sure you're not hurt or anything." I pushed against the stall door. It swung open with a creak that set my teeth on edge. The sight that greeted me will haunt me for the rest of my days. A woman was curled up on the floor, her clothes caked with dirt and what I prayed wasn't blood. Her wrists and ankles were bound with duct tape, and a filthy rag was stuffed in her mouth. But it was her eyes that got me, wide with terror, silently pleading for help. For a split second, I stood there, frozen in shock. Then survival instinct kicked in. I dropped to my knees, reaching out to remove the gag. "It's okay," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to get you out of here." As I worked on the duct tape, my mind raced. Who had done this? How long had she been here? And then a chilling thought, the man at the desk. He must have known. Was he involved? Just as I freed her hands, I heard the restroom door open. Heavy footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. The woman's eyes widened even further, a fresh wave of terror washing over her face. I stood, placing myself between her and the approaching threat. I'm not a small guy. Years of loading and unloading trucks have left me with a solid build, but I've never considered myself a fighter. Right then, though, I was ready to take on the devil himself if it meant protecting this woman. The footsteps stopped just outside the stall. I tensed, ready for whatever was coming. The door swung open. It wasn't the creepy desk guy. This man was huge, easily 6.5 feet tall and built like a linebacker. His face was hidden behind a crude mask. Was that a burlap sack? With jagged holes cut for eyes. In his hand was a wicked-looking hunting knife, its blade catching the fluorescent light. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. Then he lunged. I reacted on pure instinct, grabbing my thermos and swinging it with all my might. It connected with a satisfying thunk, hot coffee exploding everywhere. The man stumbled back, roaring in pain and anger. I didn't wait to see if he'd stay down. I scooped up the woman, who was mercifully small, and ran. We burst out of the restroom, nearly colliding with desk guy, who let out a startled yelp. "Keys!" I shouted at him. "Give me the keys to the RV outside!" His hand shook as he reached under the desk, producing a set of keys. I snatched them and ran, the woman clinging to me like a lifeline. Behind us, I could hear the big guy recovering, his enraged bellows echoing through the building. We burst through the automatic doors just as something shattered inside. Probably the desk guy paying the price for helping us. The cool night air hit us like a slap, clearing some of the adrenaline fog from my brain. The RV. It was our only chance. My truck would take too long to get moving. I sprinted across the parking lot, my lungs burning. The woman was surprisingly light in my arms, but fear gave me strength I didn't know I had. We reached the RV just as the rest stop doors flew open again. I fumbled with the keys, swearing under my breath. Behind us, heavy footsteps pounded on pavement. The door finally swung open. I practically threw the woman inside, clambering in after her and slamming it shut. The whole RV rocked as someone slammed into the side. I dove for the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered once, twice. Come on, I muttered, turning the key again. Outside, I could see a shadow moving towards the front of the vehicle. The burlap mask appeared in the windshield, those cut-out eyes staring straight at me. The engine roared to life. I threw it into drive and floored it. There was a sickening thud as we hit someone, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The RV fishtailed as we hit the main road, tires screeching in protest. I drove like a man possessed, taking random turns, doubling back, anything to throw off any potential pursuit. It wasn't until we put at least 20 miles between us and that godforsaken rest stop that I finally allowed myself to breathe. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman was huddled on the small bed in the back, watching me with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "We're safe now. I'm going to get us to the police." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I turned my eyes back to the road, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. As the miles ticked by, my mind raced. Who were those men? How long had they been operating out of that rest stop? How many other victims had there been? I thought about all the times I'd stopped at places like that over the years. All the nameless faces I'd nodded to before climbing back in my rig and driving away. How many times had I been unknowingly close to something like this? The first streaks of dawn were painting the sky when we finally reached a police station. As I helped the woman out of the RV, I made a silent vow. No more rest stops. No more risking a quick bathroom break or a cup of coffee. From now on, I'd sleep in my truck or find a real hotel. Because out there on the lonely highways, in those places where civilization thins out to almost nothing, there are monsters lurking. And sometimes they wear name tags and stand behind information desks, waiting for exhausted travelers to let their guard down. I gave my statement to the cops, watched as they took the woman to get checked out by paramedics. They told me I was a hero. I don't feel like one. I just feel lucky. Lucky that I walked out of that rest stop instead of ending up as another missing person report. Another face on a "Have you seen me" poster at some truck stop 1,000 miles away. As I climbed back into my rig, the sun now fully risen, I thought about all the miles ahead of me. The open road used to be a source of freedom, of possibility. Now it felt like a gauntlet full of hidden dangers and unseen threats. But I'm a trucker. The road is my life. So I started the engine, checked my mirrors, and pulled out of the police station parking lot. I had deliveries to make, after all. The highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of asphalt leading to who knows where. I just hope I never see that rest stop again. Some places, once you've seen what lurks beneath the surface, you can never unsee. And some coffee, no matter how bad you need it, just isn't worth the risk. The trees shouldn't have been moving like that. I've driven these roads for 20 years, but I'd never seen anything like it. As the branches reached for my truck, I realized this shortcut might be the last decision I'd ever make. It was supposed to be a routine haul, Omaha to Denver, a route I could practically drive with my eyes closed. But that night, everything went sideways, quite literally. I'd left later than usual, thanks to a loading dock snafu that ate up 2 hours of my day. By the time I hit the road, the sun was already sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Beautiful, sure, but all I could think about was the time I needed to make up. That's when I remembered the shortcut. An old logging road that cut through a stretch of national forest, shaving a good hour off the trip. I'd heard about it from some of the old-timers at the truck stop, but I'd never had reason to try it myself, until now. The turnoff was easy to miss, just a gap in the trees with a faded sign warning about rough terrain. I slowed my rig, checking my GPS. Nothing. The road didn't even show up on the map, but I could see it stretching out before me. A narrow strip of asphalt disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I hesitated for a moment. The smart thing would be to stick to the main highway, even if it meant being late. But the prospect of making up that lost time was too tempting. With a grunt, I turned the wheel, guiding my 18-wheeler onto the unmarked road. The forest swallowed us whole. One minute I was on the open plain, the next I was surrounded by towering pines, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little remained of the daylight. I flicked on my high beams, the powerful lights cutting through the gloom. For the first few miles, everything seemed normal. The road was rougher than I was used to and narrower too, but nothing my rig couldn't handle. I even started to relax a bit, thinking maybe this shortcut wasn't such a bad idea after all. That's when I noticed the fog. It crept in slowly at first, wisps of mist curling around my tires. I didn't think much of it. These forests often got foggy at night. But it kept getting thicker, until I could barely see 20 feet in front of me. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield. The fog seemed to glow in my headlights, creating an eerie, otherworldly effect. Shapes moved in the mist, tricks of the light that made me think of ghosts and other things that go bump in the night. A flicker of movement caught my eye. I glanced at my side mirror, then did a double take. Was that a face? For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a pale, elongated face peering out from the fog. its eyes glowing an unnatural green. I blinked and it was gone. "Get it together, Mike," I muttered to myself. "It's just fog and trees." But even as I said it, I didn't quite believe it. There was something off about this place. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I reached for the radio, hoping to find a station that might cut through the unnatural silence. Static. I tried another channel. More static. It was like the forest was swallowing up every signal, leaving me alone with the rumble of my engine and the increasingly wild thoughts in my head. That's when I saw it. A sign, barely visible through the fog. The words were faded, but I could just make them out. "Turn back now." My heart rate kicked up a notch. Was this some kind of joke? A warning for vehicles too big for the road ahead, or something else entirely? I slowed the truck, debating whether to heed the sign's advice. The smart move would be to turn around, to get back to the main road where things made sense. But the thought of trying to turn my rig around on this narrow stretch sent a cold sweat down my spine. No, better to push on. I'd come this far after all. The road began to wind more sharply, forcing me to slow to a crawl. The trees pressed in closer, their branches scraping against the sides of my trailer. It was like the forest itself was trying to hold me back, to keep me from going any further. And then I saw them, the moving trees. At first, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks on me again. But as I watched, mouth agape, I saw a massive pine tree slowly bend towards the road. Its trunk groaned, bark splitting as it moved in a way no tree should move. I slammed on the brakes, the sudden stop sending a shudder through the entire rig. For a moment, all I could do was stare. The tree's branches reached out, questing fingers of wood and needle that scraped against my windshield. "This isn't happening," I whispered. But it was. All around me, the forest was coming alive. Trees swayed and bent without any wind, their branches intertwining to form a canopy so thick it blotted out the sky entirely. I threw the truck into reverse, but the tires just spun uselessly. Looking in my side mirror, I saw Y roots had erupted from the ground, wrapping themselves around my wheels like gnarled fingers. Panic set in. I gunned the engine, the smell of burning rubber filling the cab as I tried to break free. The truck rocked back and forth, but the roots held firm. If anything, they seemed to be pulling me deeper into their embrace. A sharp crack made me jump. A branch had punched through the passenger side window, showering the seat with broken glass. As I watched in horror, the branch began to twist and elongate, reaching for me with unnatural purpose. I scrambled out of the driver's seat, pressing myself against the far wall of the cab. The branch followed, its tips splitting into smaller tendrils that probed the air like fingers. They brushed against my cheek, rough bark scraping my skin, and I let out a strangled yell. In desperation, I grabbed my thermos from the cup holder and swung it with all my might. It connected with a satisfying thunk, and the branch recoiled. But my victory was short-lived. More branches were forcing their way in through the broken window, and I could hear an ominous creaking from the roof of the cab. I had to get out, had to run. It was suicide, but staying in the truck was certain death. With shaking hands, I reached for the door handle. The moment I opened the door, the forest seemed to go into a frenzy. Branches whipped through the air, leaves rustled with a sound like maniacal laughter. I leapt from the cab, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline kept me moving. I ran like I'd never run before, ducking and weaving through the grasping branches. The fog swirled around me, so thick I could barely see where I was going. But I didn't dare stop. Behind me, I could hear my truck groaning as the forest claimed it, metal shrieking as it was torn apart by implacable wooden fingers. Roots tried to trip me, bursting from the ground at my feet. Branches lashed out, leaving stinging cuts on my face and arms. But still I ran, driven by a terror so primal it overrode every other thought. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that hellish forest. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but the fear of what was behind me kept me going. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I burst out of the trees. The fog melted away, and I found myself on the side of a highway. Real, normal, blessedly ordinary highway. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. Behind me, the forest looked normal. Just a thick stand of trees, nothing moving except for a slight breeze rustling the leaves. Had I imagined it all? But the cuts on my arms, the ache in my ankle, the leaves and twigs tangled in my hair, they were all too real. And my truck was gone, swallowed up by whatever nightmare I'd just escaped. A car approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I waved my arms frantically, and to my immense relief, it slowed to a stop. An older couple peered out at me, concern etched on their faces. "Are you all right, son?" the man asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I explain what had happened? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, maybe I was crazy. I got lost, I managed to croak out. Took a wrong turn. The woman clucked sympathetically. "Well, hop in, we'll give you a ride to the next town. You can sort yourself out there." As I climbed into their car, I couldn't help but look back at the forest. In the glow of the taillights, I could have sworn I saw movement among the trees, a branch waving, almost like it was saying goodbye. The drive to town was a blur. I must have dozed off, the adrenaline crash hitting me hard. When we arrived, the couple dropped me off at a small motel, refusing my feeble offers of payment for the ride. That night, as I lay in the lumpy motel bed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been some kind of hallucination? A waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and the strange shadows of the forest. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was out there in those woods, something ancient and hungry, something that didn't take kindly to trespassers. I never drove truck again after that night. Couldn't bring myself to get behind the wheel, knowing what might be lurking just off the beaten path. Some of the guys at the depot thought I'd had some kind of breakdown. Maybe I had. All I know is sometimes when I'm driving down a lonely stretch of road and I see a turnoff leading into a dark forest, I get a chill down my spine. And I keep driving, eyes straight ahead, never slowing down. Because out there in the woods, where the maps don't reach and the GPS can't find you, there are things waiting, things that move in ways they shouldn't. And if you're not careful, if you take that one wrong turn, you might just find yourself on a road you can never leave. The glowing orb hovered in front of my truck for 3 impossible seconds before it vanished. If it weren't for the dash cam footage, I'd have sworn I was losing my mind. But the evidence was there, clear as day, and it was about to turn my life upside down. It had been a long haul, the kind that makes you question why you ever thought trucking was a good career choice. 18 hours on the road, fueled by gas station coffee, and the kind of determination that comes from knowing you've got bills to pay. I was on the home stretch, just 2 hours out from my drop-off point when it happened. The clock on my dash read 3:17 a.m. The highway stretched out before me, empty save for the occasional long-haul trucker like myself. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. It was the kind of night that makes you believe in ghost stories and things that go bump in the dark. I just passed a sign welcoming me to Nevada when I first noticed the light. At first, I thought it was just another truck coming up behind me, its headlights distorted by my tired eyes. But as I watched in my rearview mirror, I realized this light was different. It was a perfect sphere, glowing with a soft, pulsating blue light that seemed to push back the darkness around it. "What the hell?" I muttered, blinking hard. Maybe I'd finally hit that wall of exhaustion I'd been fighting off for the last 100 miles. But when I looked again, the orb was still there, and it was getting closer. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I watched it approach. It was moving fast, much faster than any vehicle I'd ever seen. In a matter of seconds, it had drawn level with my cab. That's when things got really weird. The orb slowed to match my speed, hovering just outside my driver's side window. This close, I could see that it wasn't just blue. Swirls of green and purple danced across its surface, reminding me of the lava lamps my sister used to love when we were kids. I held my breath, torn between fascination and fear. What was this thing? Some kind of drone? A hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road? Suddenly, the orb shot forward, positioning itself directly in front of my truck. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, everything was silent. The orb just floated there, its light reflecting off my windshield and bathing the cab in an otherworldly glow. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. 1 second it was there, the next it had vanished into thin air, leaving me alone on the dark highway with nothing but the rumble of my idling engine and the frantic beating of my own heart. I sat there for a long moment, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a dream, some kind of waking hallucination, but I could still feel the chill that had run down my spine when that thing appeared, could still see the afterimage of its glow when I closed my eyes. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone. I needed to tell someone, needed to make sure I wasn't going crazy. But who would believe me? I'd sound like a lunatic ranting about floating orbs on a deserted highway. That's when I remembered the dash cam. I'd installed it a few months back, more as a precaution against accidents than anything else. Now it might hold the key to proving I wasn't losing my mind. I pulled over to the side of the road and retrieved the camera, my fingers fumbling with the small screen. It took a few tries to rewind to the right spot, but then, there it was. Clear as day, the orb appeared on the screen, glowing and pulsating just as I'd seen it. I watched, mouth agape, as it moved in front of my truck and then vanished. "Holy shit," I whispered. It was real. All of it was real. I must have watched that clip a dozen times, scrutinizing every second. Each time I hoped to find some logical explanation, some trick of the light that would make sense of what I'd seen. But there was no denying it. I had footage of something that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. The question was, what the hell was I supposed to do with it? My first instinct was to share it, post it online, let the world see what I'd witnessed. But as I sat there, thumb hovering over the upload button, a chill ran down my spine. What if this was bigger than I realized? What if there were people out there who wouldn't want this kind of thing getting out? I've heard stories. We all have. Truckers who claim they've seen things out on the lonely highways, things that defy explanation. Most of us write it off as exhaustion or too many stimulants. But now, with this video burning a hole in my pocket, I wasn't so sure. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself, at least for the time being. I finished my route, delivered my cargo, and headed home. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The world felt different now, bigger and stranger than I'd ever realized. For weeks after, I found myself jumping at every flash of light, every unexpected reflection. I scoured the internet for similar sightings, for any scrap of information that might explain what I'd seen. There were plenty of stories out there, blurry photos and shaky videos that claimed to show UFOs or other unexplained phenomena, but nothing quite like what I'd experienced. I started taking different routes, avoiding that stretch of Nevada highway where it had happened. Part of me hoped to see the orb again, to prove to myself that it hadn't been a one-time thing. Another part of me was terrified of exactly that. It was about a month after the incident when things took another turn. I was at a truck stop in Arizona enjoying a much-needed meal that didn't come from a vending machine when I noticed the man watching me. He was sitting in a booth across the diner, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. He was dressed casually enough, jeans, flannel shirt, work boots, but something about him set my nerves on edge. Maybe it was the way his eyes never seemed to leave me or the slight bulge under his jacket that hinted at a concealed weapon. I finished my meal quickly, suddenly eager to get back on the road. As I stood to leave, the man stood too. My heart rate kicked up a notch. I headed for the door, resisting the urge to look back over my shoulder. The parking lot was dark, lit only by the harsh glow of sodium lamps. I quickened my pace, fishing my keys out of my pocket. Just as I reached my truck, I heard footsteps behind me. "Excuse me, sir?" I turned, my back pressed against the cool metal of my rig. The man from the diner stood a few feet away, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "I think we need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. "About what you saw out on Highway 93 last month." My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know about that? I'd never told a soul, never uploaded the video or even mentioned it online. "I don't know what you're talking about," I managed to say, my mouth dry. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you do. The orb, blue light, moved faster than anything you've ever seen. Ring any bells?" I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Who was this guy? Government? Military? Something else entirely? "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone who's very interested in what you saw," he replied. "And in the footage I know you have?" My hand instinctively went to my pocket where my phone sat with a copy of the video. The man's eyes followed the movement, his smile widening slightly. "I'm not here to threaten you," he said, taking a step closer. "In fact, I'm here to offer you an opportunity, a chance to understand what you saw, to be part of something bigger." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to run, to jump in my truck and drive until this all felt like a bad dream. But another part, the part that had been consumed with questions since that night on the highway, was intrigued. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked cautiously. The man reached into his jacket, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought he was going for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a business card, offering it to me. "We're a group of like-minded individuals," he said as I took the card. "People who've seen things they can't explain, who want answers. We think you might be able to help us find those answers." I looked down at the card. It was plain white with only a phone number and 2 words printed in simple black text: Project Luminous. When I looked up again, the man was already walking away. He paused at the edge of the parking lot, turning back to me one last time. "Think about it," he called, "but don't take too long. We'll be in touch." And then he was gone, swallowed up by the darkness beyond the truck stop's lights. I stood there for a long time, the business card heavy in my hand. Part of me wanted to crumple it up, to toss it away and pretend none of this had ever happened. To go back to my life of long hauls and lonely highways where the strangest thing I had to worry about was a blown tire or a bad cup of coffee. But I knew I couldn't. Whatever I'd seen out there in the Nevada desert, whatever that glowing orb had been, it had changed something in me, opened my eyes to a world I never knew existed. As I climbed into my truck and fired up the engine, I slipped the card into my wallet. I didn't know if I'd call the number, didn't know if I was ready to go down whatever rabbit hole this Project Luminous might lead me into. But I did know one thing. The next time I hit the road, I'd be watching the skies a little more closely. Because out there in the dark, where the city lights fade and the stars shine bright, there are things moving in the night. Things that defy explanation, that challenge everything we think we know about the world. And sometimes, if you're lucky or unlucky enough, you might just catch a glimpse of them. The first time I saw the black SUV in my rearview mirror, I thought nothing of it. By the third day, as it followed me across state lines, I knew I was in trouble. What I didn't know was why or how far they'd go to get what they wanted. My name's Jack, and I've been driving truck for the better part of 2 decades. Long hauls, mostly. The kind where you spend more time with your rig than you do with your family. It's not an easy life, but it's mine, and I've always taken pride in doing my job well. This particular run started like any other. A full load of electronics headed from Chicago to Los Angeles. Valuable cargo, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that should have put a target on my back. I first noticed the SUV about an hour outside of Chicago. Black, nondescript, windows tinted so dark they looked like mirrors. It was keeping pace with me, always a few car lengths back. Not close enough to be tailgating, but near enough that I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At first, I brushed it off. Plenty of people take long road trips, and this was a major highway. Coincidences happen, but as the hours ticked by and the SUV remained a constant presence in my mirrors, that uneasy feeling in my gut started to grow. By the time I crossed into Iowa, I was sure. This wasn't coincidence. They were following me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of traffic enforcement, keeping an eye on trucks to make sure we weren't violating any regulations. But if that was the case, why hadn't they pulled me over? Why the cloak and dagger routine? As night fell, I pulled into a truck stop. I needed fuel, both for the rig and for myself. Coffee and a sandwich from the attached diner sounded like heaven after hours of protein bars and energy drinks. The SUV pulled in right behind me, parking a few spaces away. I watched in my side mirror as 2 men got out. They were dressed casually, jeans, dark jackets. But something about the way they moved set off alarm bells in my head. These weren't tourists or traveling salesmen. They moved with purpose, with a kind of coiled energy that spoke of training. I waited until they went into the convenience store before I made my move. Quick as I could, I fueled up and got back on the road. My hands were shaking as I pulled back onto the highway, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. For about 20 minutes, I thought I'd lost them. The relief was palpable, like a weight lifting off my chest. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I saw them, headlights in the distance, gaining fast. "Shit," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. What the hell had I gotten myself into? I spent the next few hours playing a twisted game of cat and mouse. I'd speed up, they'd match my pace, I'd slow down, they'd hang back. At one point, I even took an exit, looped around and got back on the highway going the other direction. They were right there with me, smooth as silk. By the time I crossed into Nebraska, exhaustion was starting to set in. I couldn't keep this up forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to stop. To sleep, to eat, to comply with regulations about driving hours. And when I did, they'd be waiting. It was somewhere around North Platte that I finally cracked. I couldn't take the tension anymore, the constant looking over my shoulder. I needed answers. I saw a sign for an upcoming rest area and made a decision. If this was going to come to a head, better to do it on my terms. I took the exit, guiding my rig into the nearly empty parking area. The SUV followed, as I knew it would. Heart pounding, I climbed down from the cab. The SUV's doors opened, and the two men I'd seen at the truck stop got out. Up close, they looked even more intimidating. One was tall and lean, with close-cropped hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The other was shorter but built like a linebacker, with hands that looked like they could bend steel. "All right," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "You've been following me for the better part of 1,000 miles. Want to tell me why?" The tall one stepped forward, his hand moving to the inside of his jacket. I tensed, half expecting him to pull a gun. Instead, he produced a badge. "Agent Carlson, FBI," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "This is Agent Ramirez. We need to talk about your cargo, Mr. Sullivan." I blinked, thrown off balance. The FBI? What the hell did the feds want with a truckload of consumer electronics? "My cargo?" I repeated. "It's all above board. You can check the manifest." "We're not interested in what's on the manifest," Ramirez cut in. His voice was deeper than I expected, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "We're interested in what's not on it." A chill ran down my spine. "I don't understand." Carlson sighed, exchanging a look with his partner. "Mr. Sullivan, we have reason to believe that your truck is being used to transport illegal goods, specifically a prototype piece of technology that was stolen from a government research facility 3 days ago." My mind reeled. Illegal goods? Stolen tech? This had to be some kind of mistake. "That's impossible," I said. "I loaded this truck myself. It's nothing but laptops and smartphones, I swear." "We believe the item was planted in your cargo without your knowledge," Ramirez said. "Probably during a stop or maybe even at the loading dock. The people we're dealing with are resourceful." I leaned against my truck, suddenly feeling lightheaded. If what they were saying was true, I'd been driving around with hot government property for days. No wonder they'd been following me. But why not just stop me and search the truck? As if reading my mind, Carlson spoke up. "We couldn't risk tipping our hand too soon. The group behind this theft has eyes and ears everywhere. If they realized we were onto them, they might have tried to intercept the cargo, or worse." The unspoken threat hung in the air. These weren't just thieves we were dealing with. They were dangerous, maybe even killers. "So what now?" I asked, my mouth dry. "Now," Carlson said, "we need your help. We're going to search your truck, find the device, and then you're going to continue on your route as if nothing happened." I stared at him, sure I'd misheard. "You want me to keep driving? With a bunch of thieves thinking I'm carrying their stolen goods?" Ramirez nodded. "It's the best way to draw them out. They'll have to make a move to retrieve the item eventually. When they do, we'll be waiting." My head was spinning. This morning, my biggest concern had been making my delivery on time. Now I was being drafted into some kind of high-stakes sting operation. "Do I have a choice?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Carlson's expression softened slightly. "You're not under arrest, Mr. Sullivan. We can't force you to do this, but a lot of lives could be at stake. The technology these people stole, and in the wrong hands, it could be catastrophic." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. Part of me wanted to walk away, to tell these agents to find someone else to play bait. But I knew I couldn't. Whatever was going on, I was already involved. Might as well see it through. "All right," I said, opening my eyes. "I'm in. What do you need me to do?" The next few hours were a blur. The agents went through my truck with a fine-toothed comb, eventually finding a small, innocuous-looking box hidden inside a crate of laptops. Carlson handled it like it was made of nitroglycerin, carefully placing it in a lead-lined case. They briefed me on the plan. I was to continue to LA as if nothing had happened. They'd follow at a distance, monitoring me through a tracker they installed in the truck. If anyone tried to intercept me, I was to play dumb and let them take what they thought was their stolen tech. As dawn broke, I climbed back into my rig. Carlson handed me a small device. no bigger than a matchbox. "Emergency beacon," he explained. "If things go south, press this. We'll be there in minutes." I nodded, tucking it into my pocket. As I started the engine, Ramirez leaned in through the window. "Be careful out there," he said, his expression grave. "These people, they're not playing games. If they realize the real device is gone, there's no telling what they might do." With that comforting thought, I pulled back onto the highway. The SUV stayed behind, but I knew they were watching. Just like I knew someone else was probably watching too. The miles rolled by, each one feeling like it might be my last. Every car that passed me, every truck that pulled alongside sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Were they here for the device? Were they watching me right now? By the time I hit Colorado, the paranoia was eating me alive. I jumped at every shadow, flinched at every unexpected sound. This must be what it feels like to go mad, I thought. It was just outside of Denver that it happened. A black sedan pulled up beside me, keeping pace. The passenger window rolled down and I saw the glint of metal. A gun. My heart leapt into my throat. This was it. The moment we'd been waiting for, the moment I'd been dreading. With shaking hands, I reached for the emergency beacon, but before I could press it, a deafening explosion rocked my world. The sedan's tire had blown out, sending it careening off the road. In my mirror, I saw the black SUV appear as if by magic, cutting off the sedan's escape. Carlson and Ramirez leapt out, weapons drawn. It was over in minutes. The men from the sedan were in cuffs, and I was pulling over, my legs so weak I could barely work the pedals. "You did good, Jack," Carlson said as I climbed down from the cab on shaky legs. "We got them, all of them." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me feeling hollow and drained. "What happens now?" I finally managed to ask. Ramirez smiled, clapping me on the shoulder. Now you get to be a hero, just a hero no one can ever know about." As I watched them load the suspects into a waiting van, I realized my life would never be the same. I'd seen behind the curtain, glimpsed a world most people never know exists. A world of secrets and shadows, of high-stakes games played out on the highways and byways of America. I climbed back into my truck, ready to finish this delivery and put this whole crazy experience behind me. But as I pulled back onto the road, I couldn't shake one thought. What other secrets were out there, hiding in plain sight? And how many other truckers like me were unwittingly carrying them across the country 1 mile at a time? The mirror showed a face that wasn't mine. I blinked and it blinked back, but those weren't my eyes and that wasn't my reflection. That's when I realized the truck stop bathroom was more than just a place to wash up. It was a gateway to somewhere else entirely. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years, crisscrossing the country more times than I can count. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out on the road. Unexplained lights in the sky, ghostly figures on lonely stretches of highway, the kind of things you chalk up to exhaustion and too much caffeine. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened at that rundown truck stop in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. It had been a long haul, St. Louis to Seattle, and I was about halfway through. The sun had set hours ago, and I was running on fumes, both literally and figuratively. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead, and the white lines on the road had started to dance in front of me. I knew I needed to stop, to grab some coffee and splash some water on my face before I became another statistic, another trucker who pushed too hard and paid the price. The gas, food, lodging sign was like a beacon in the darkness. I didn't care that the place looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the Reagan administration. All I cared about was the promise of caffeine and a chance to stretch my legs. I pulled my rig into the nearly empty parking lot, the brakes hissing as I set them. The neon "Open 24 Hours" sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie red glow over the cracked pavement. As I climbed down from the cab, a gust of wind kicked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and diesel and something else, something musty and old that I couldn't quite place. The bell over the door jangled as I walked in, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet store. A bored-looking teenager glanced up from her phone, barely acknowledging my presence before returning to her screen. I made a beeline for the coffee machine, grimacing at the sludge that passed for coffee, but pouring myself a cup anyway. Caffeine was caffeine, after all. "Restroom?" I asked the clerk. She pointed to a door at the back of the store without looking up. I grabbed my coffee and headed that way, my boots echoing on the linoleum floor. The bathroom was about what you'd expect from a place like this. Dingy tiles, flickering fluorescent light, and a pervasive smell of industrial cleaner that didn't quite mask other, less pleasant odors. But it was a place to wash up, and right then, that's all I cared about. I set my coffee on the edge of the sink and turned on the faucet, cupping my hands under the stream of lukewarm water. As I splashed my face, I could almost feel the road grime washing away. I reached for a paper towel, dried off, and then looked up at the mirror. That's when everything went sideways. The face staring back at me wasn't mine. Oh, it was close. Same general shape, same tired eyes, but the details were all wrong. The hair was a different color, the nose a different shape, and the eyes were green, not brown like mine. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. The face in the mirror blinked too, but it didn't change. It wasn't my reflection, it was someone else entirely. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice echoing off the tiled walls. The lips in the mirror moved with mine, but the words that came out were different. "Help me," the reflection said, its voice a hoarse whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. I was tired, that was all, hallucinating from lack of sleep. I turned away from the mirror, squeezing my eyes shut and counting to 10. When I opened them, everything would be back to normal. 1, 2, 3. A cold breeze brushed against my skin, carrying with it that same musty smell I'd noticed outside, but that was impossible. There were no windows in here, no vents that I could see. 4, 5, 6. The fluorescent light above me flickered, the buzz growing louder, more insistent. It sounded almost like voices whispering just at the edge of hearing. 7, 8, 9. The cold intensified, and I could have sworn I felt something brush against my arm. Phantom fingers there and gone in an instant. 10. I opened my eyes and turned back to the mirror. For a split second, I saw my own reflection, normal and familiar. Then it rippled, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a thrown stone. And suddenly, I wasn't looking at a mirror at all. The glass had become a window looking out onto a vast, dark landscape. Gray sand stretched as far as I could see, dotted with twisted, leafless trees. The sky was a sickly green, roiling with clouds that moved too fast to be natural. And in the distance, barely visible, were structures, impossible buildings that seemed to defy gravity, their angles all wrong in a way that hurt my eyes to look at. Where am I?" I whispered, unable to look away from the nightmare landscape before me. "The in-between," came the reply, that same hoarse whisper from before. I realized it was coming from my own mouth, but it wasn't my voice. Something else was speaking through me. The place between places, the gaps in the world that most can't see. I wanted to run, to get the hell out of that bathroom and never look back, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to even blink. "Why am I here?" I managed to ask, my real voice barely a croak. "Because you saw, because you noticed." The voice was sad, resigned. "Most pass through without ever knowing. But some see the cracks. And once you see, you can't unsee." A figure appeared in the distance, walking towards the mirror window. As it got closer, I realized with a jolt that it was me. Or rather, it was the face I'd seen in the mirror earlier. My doppelganger, but not quite. "Who are you?" I asked as it reached the glass. "I'm you," it replied. "Or I was. I'm what's left after years in this place. Time works differently here." A chill ran down my spine. "How long have you been here?" The other me smiled, but it was a hollow expression, devoid of any real emotion. "A day, a century, both, neither. Time has no meaning in the in-between." "How do I get out?" I asked, panic rising in my throat. The doppelganger pressed its hand against the glass. "You don't, not really. Once you've seen, a part of you stays here forever, but—" It hesitated, looking over its shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "There's a way to go back, to forget, at least for a while." How? I was ready to do anything, promise anything to get out of this nightmare. "Take my place," it said. "Let me go back. I've been here so long. I barely remember what it's like out there. Give me a chance to live again and you can stay here. Eventually another will come. Another will see. And then you can offer them the same choice." I stared at my other self, horror and understanding dawning simultaneously. This was a trap, an endless cycle. How many others had stood where I was standing, made the choice I was being asked to make? But as I looked at that bleak landscape, felt the oppressive weight of the in-between pressing down on me, I realized I didn't have a choice, not really. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, I'll do it." The doppelganger's face lit up with the first real emotion I'd seen. Hope, tinged with a desperate hunger that made me want to recoil. It pressed both hands against the glass now, and I found myself mirroring the action. The surface of the mirror window rippled again, and suddenly I was falling forward, tumbling into that alien landscape. I hit the ground hard, the gray sand cold and gritty against my skin. When I looked up, I saw myself, my real self, standing in the truck stop bathroom, looking out at me with a mixture of relief and guilt. "I'm sorry," my voice said, but it wasn't me speaking anymore. "Thank you." And then the window was gone, replaced by a sheet of silvery, opaque material that reflected the dead landscape around me. I don't know how long I've been here. Time, like my doppelganger said, has no meaning in this place. I wander the gray dunes, watching the impossible buildings shift and change in the distance. Sometimes I see others, lost souls like me, trapped in this liminal space. We don't speak. There's nothing to say, but sometimes I find myself drawn to reflective surfaces, puddles of strange liquid, shards of mirror-like material half buried in the sand. And in them, I catch glimpses of the other side. Truck stops, gas stations, dingy bathrooms across the country. I wait, and I watch, because someday someone else will see. Someone else will notice the cracks in the world, the places where reality wears thin. And when they do, I'll be waiting. I'll offer them the choice, the same one that was offered to me. And maybe, just maybe, I'll get to go home. So the next time you're at a truck stop in the middle of nowhere, exhausted and just looking to wash up, take a good long look in the mirror. That face staring back at you? Make sure it's really yours. Because if it's not, well, you might just be looking at me, and I've been waiting a very long time for someone to take my place.